One second. Okay, I'm trying to find my tab, so hold on one second. So hi, everybody. My name is Venesa Alicea-Chuqui. I am working on finding my tab to share my screen. And I will do that right now. Let's see. Do you see does it say dark matter there? Okay, great. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here with you all today. I'm going to share a little bit about my career path. I'm going to talk about some of the projects I worked on, but one of the things that's interesting about sort of me, and let's see how I go to the next slide, is I have a very traditional career path. I know some of the speakers that have been part of this, this course and that we're sort of co-teaching have some very interesting practices, and they are really inspirations to me and sort of where I am at this, what I would call a pivot in my career. So I'm an architect. I'm registered. I got my license in 2010. So I'm going on 10 years of being a registered architect in New York State. I consider myself an educator. I've been teaching at the City College of New York. I'm not teaching this semester, but I teach professional practice, which is also called architectural management. And I've taught a co-op internship class for students who are working, which I refer to as a pro practice 101, sort of like how, career advising and coaching as they are working in firms. And then I am also an advocate. And one of the things that I found really interesting as I was developing sort of as a young architect was that I got involved with organizations and I got opportunities to lead programming and initiatives that I wasn't getting specifically in the office. And I learned a lot about how to work with people, how to communicate, and also I was able to work on some really exciting projects that I don't think I would have had an opportunity to work on sort of in a traditional architecture firm, which is where I was at. So I recently started my own practice, Nivark Architecture, and I am back in graduate school. So I am a student like you. I have decided after 15 years to go back to school. I'm studying urban policy and leadership. And part of the reason why is because as an architect, I've been really questioning what I'm doing and really looking to see how to connect the architecture of the built environment with the policies that are created to they sort of, there's a huge responsibility on the policy side and on the equity ownership side that they're making a lot of decisions for communities that I grew up in. And I started to have a little bit of a take issue with certain projects in neighborhoods that I grew up in New York City. And so part of what I wanted to do was be able to further understand the policies and procedures, why these are being put in place, to see how we can help sort of work with the community to create a sort of a better, more sustainable, more healthy, resilient community. And so that's sort of where I'm at right now. So I'm at the beginning of a 2-year transition where I'm working on graduate school, and I have a small practice where I'm working on some interesting renovation projects in Brooklyn. And also I'm working on a master plan for my family's land in Puerto Rico, which I'll talk a little bit about. And I think that's one of the goals for me, to be able to have my own time to be able to work on these things. So this is what I would say, we call this like the pipeline. This is a graphic that was developed with a group of young architects that I work with in New York, with the AIA Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And we had an initiative called Next Gen ARC. And one of the things that we were looking at is, you know, where are people going? Where are they in their practice? Where are we losing young architects? You know, where are the numbers? And part of, so we created this like leaky pipeline graphic. It's still not perfect because there's lots of like tangential things, but the idea is that you sort of start at this, I want to be an architect, right? And then as you sort of go along the path to become an architect, there's lots of things that, that are along the way that can impact your choices, right? So money, which would be salaries, you know, like either whether you're getting a job in architecture or not. Access, right? That's part of this, like, what if you don't know where to go? What if you don't know people in architecture? How do you actually get access into the firms to be able to hire you? Then there's sort of, and that's also for, sorry, like access and money is also related to education, right? To be able to go to architecture school, that's a privilege, right? It costs money to get the degree that you need. And a lot of people also, you know, feel that, especially I think students of color feel like the master's degree is more a qualifier, right? So the idea that you need this additional credential to validate you as a professional is something that, I mean, I've struggled with, and I finally decided that I have to go back to school because even though I'm licensed, I still do not have my master's degree. And I don't necessarily, I think that there's other ways, but that is a reality, right? So that the cost of education is something that we have to think about. There's also sort of this interest, the time demand and the commitment that we're talking about when you're in architecture school. You know, do you have what it takes? I say it in quotes because, you know, sometimes there's this perception that, I don't know if they do it in your school, but when I was in school, and a lot of people have had this where, you know, they say, look to your right, look to your left, you know, you're probably not, you know, 1 in 5 of you will make it through the architecture program or whatever that is, right? And the idea is that they really want, I think that there's people who are really committed to the profession will stay, and they don't necessarily make it easy for everybody, right? So some of these paths for some people are really, really difficult. And I have been fortunate in that I had mentors along the way that really helped me and guided me. I also had a very traditional career path, right? I had the ability to have an internship while I was in school, and I will sort of talk a little bit about that because that had a huge impact on sort of my future career choices, but also on what I learned while I was working in a firm. But then there's this experience component, right? So the experience component is after you've graduated school, you're getting hired, and there's potentially a stagnant, you know, salary. Right now, a lot of students coming out have are, you know, there's a slight dip in what firms are able to pay because it's an uncertain future. I think, though, just to be a little bit more positive, I think there's a huge opportunity for graduates coming out to be very, very, way more creative, to use your design skills to so many different things. So I think that this is actually a really great time for architects. There's also this concept of glass ceilings, and a lot of people tend to, if they're in firms, they feel like they hit a ceiling or a corner. I feel like I hit like a little bit of a corner, not necessarily a ceiling. And you sort of have to figure out where you fit in the profession. And then at the same time, as you're working on your experience, you also are working on taking your tests, right? To become a registered architect, you have to take a series of tests. There's 6 exams. And a lot of times, you know, family might happen in between or caregiving. I think, you know, right now we're dealing with taking care of some elders in our family, and that all of that is time that is potentially taking away from your process of becoming an architect. So these are all things that happen along the way. And for some people, this path is really long. And for some people, they're able to get through it quicker. I think however long it takes you, I think that it's your own journey, right? You're able to claim that for what it is. It's just acknowledge that there's so much more opportunities for support along the way now than there was. So I just want to let you know that you're all not alone. Everybody sort of has gone through this and has a different story. So I'm going to sort of share my story with you. This was a slide that I had shared at the presentation on the first week that sort of is a really sort of crude version of what I've done, right? So I was fortunate in that I went to a specialized high school. I took a test. My mom made me take a test at the time. I didn't even know what I was doing, but I took a test to get into a school. And I got the ability to go to a school that had, in the last 2 years of high school, we got to choose a major, right? And that was something that at the time, I was between architecture and Latin American literature. I don't know how or why those two things, it's interesting because they're both coming back now, but I chose architecture. My uncle's an architect. And I never realized actually until I got older that he had a major influence in my career choices. My stepfather was also a woodworker. So I chose it because it was something that I was vaguely familiar with and I enjoyed it. So I then decided to pursue it for college. I went to the City College of New York. At the time I had, I didn't really have any money. I didn't grow up with a lot of money, so I had to pay for school. So I only applied to the City College of New York. And I was working as a lifeguard and a swimming instructor at the time. So I was able to sort of pay through school as I went. They had evening studios and weekend studios. So it was really great because we would take studios like Wednesday night and Saturdays, which allowed me to work during my time. And as I was in school, I got a job with Gary McNeil, who was a professor at the school. He was the coordinator for the 5th year program, and he was a Black architect who had a small firm in Harlem. And it was give or take 6 people. So at the smallest, it was maybe 3 or 4 of us. And at the largest, I think at one point there was like 6 or 7 of us. And we worked on a lot of projects in Harlem. And I worked there up to 2 years after graduation. And then, so about 5 years total. And then I decided it was time for me to try something new. And I had for my thesis project, I don't know, do you all do thesis? Roderick, do they do thesis projects? Or comprehensive design?
We do comprehensive design, and it's like a mini thesis. So they this is for architects in their 5th year. They do a research document in the fall, and they do a design based on that in the spring.
Okay. So we had something similar where we had a year-long thesis project, and one of the things that I was looking at was libraries as public space and sort of the future of libraries. And my mom's a librarian. She had been with New York Public Library for 35 years. So libraries were a building type that I was really, really interested in. So when I was in school, I did a series of case studies on some libraries in New York. And one of them was the Bronx Library Center, which was designed by Datner Architects. And I really enjoyed the building. And so I reached out to them and I sort of shared some of the work I had done for my thesis project. And I was able to get an interview and I was able to get hired. And then I was there for 11 years. I loved it. It was great. I got to work on lots of different really amazing affordable housing projects around the city, some schools, community centers, a YMCA. So some really great work. And then in 2018 or 2017, when Hurricane Maria happened, there was a sort of a pivot that I went through in sort of thinking about where I really wanted to be in my career and what I wanted to be doing. And one of those things was to have the flexibility to work between New York and Puerto Rico. And the fact that I wasn't able to just pick up and go down to Puerto Rico to help was something that made me really change my career sort of trajectory. So this is a picture of Gary McNeil. Gary is, for me, sort of he was a mentor. He is a close friend, a colleague, and he was an alumnus of City College of New York, so we share an alma mater. He was one of the first graduating class. It was class of 65. He was part of a huge movement that was happening in Harlem at the time. He was also one of the founders of NYCOBA, which is the New York Coalition of Black Architects. And I think for me, so I identify as New Yorican, which is a Puerto Rican born and raised in New York. But for me, my first experience was under a Black architect. And I think that there was something so amazing about that, in that, one, I learned how a small architecture practice ran. But to me, this was, it was part of my, like, it was my first job, right? So this was like all of the things that I was learning were things that, you know, really created and sort of nurtured where I am now, right? And one of the things I really liked about the way Gary ran his practice is that it was a teaching firm. He knew that people were not going to stay, right? Because it was small, and he ran it in a way that was sort of training you to move on and go on to your next thing, right? And he always was extremely supportive of, I was very active when I was a student, and he used to joke, "You're going to be president of the AIA one day," or whatever it was I was involved with at the time. And but he wasn't a member. He wasn't necessarily a fan. He had his own opinions about certain things, but he completely supported all of my interests. And when I went on to Datner, we still sort of stayed in touch to this day. And I was really, I think he had a huge impact on sort of me and who I am. And he actually introduced me to Max Bond. So I think part of what I really sort of am inspired by are like the people who came before us, right? And so to me, like Max Bond and what he did for Harlem and for sort of architecture in general, I think is something that is really important. And I'm very much interested in architecture for the people and how do we engage community in our designs. I lived in Harlem for 15 years, so a lot of the work that happens in Harlem is something that I'm very interested in. When I was little, my mom worked in a library in Harlem, so I feel a connection to it, and so I really appreciate the work of a lot of the architects in Harlem, and I will say that they don't get enough credit because a lot of the small firms are not getting the opportunities to design the buildings that are going up in that neighborhood. And so I've witnessed firsthand how a lot of work can go into trying to get a project, but then it goes to somebody else who is not from the community. And part of what I'm very interested in is how do we get people who are active and involved in the community to be able to be part of these design decisions and conversations of what happens. So I transitioned to Datner Architects, and that's me. I had a wonderful corner seat. I was living the life, working on amazing projects. I was I became an associate, I think 8 years in. And then I was part of some of the management conversations. We were able to start a sustainable practice group, really focus on pushing sustainability. I led a lot of the professional development efforts. I think right before I left, we actually started an official like mentorship program. And the gentleman in the corner, this is William Stein. He is one of the partners that I worked with most closely, and he was also a City College alum. And one of the reasons why I chose Datner Architects when I was looking, other than the fact that I really enjoyed all their work and the libraries, was that they had two partners that were City College alum, and Richard Datner, who's the founding principal, was a professor at City College for about 10 or 15 years. And I say that because I didn't go to an Ivy League school, right? And so having a firm that respected the school that I went to was something that was really important to me. Also, all of the partners in the firm had been involved in the AIA at some level. And I was very active on the board for the AIA, and I wanted a firm that was going to support my board involvement. And so they actually gave me time to be able to go to monthly board meetings that were like from 4 to 6, right? So they were very flexible with my schedule to be able to let that happen. The other reason why I chose Datner Architects was because of the New Housing New York competition. So the New Housing New York competition was something that actually, when I was in school, was just an ideas competition. And for 4th year, we had our studio projects that was focused on sort of this prototypes of sustainable, affordable housing. And because I was involved with the AIA in 2007, when the AIA was celebrating 150 years, they got a component, they got a grant from AIA National to do what they were calling legacy projects. So each city was proposing legacy projects, and New Housing New York was New York's legacy project, right? And so what it was a partnership with the city to really look at a prototype for sustainable, affordable housing, but a built one, right? So that eventually Datner Architects with Grimshaw Architects actually won the competition. And I was able to actually work on it, which was so exciting because I had looked at it for my 4th year studio project. So it was fun to sort of fast forward on it. I am going to show you some slides on it, but this is in the South Bronx. It's on East 156th Street and Brook Avenue. And it was completed in about 2012, 2013. So we worked on it for a few years. The competition was finished in 2007. And it was a really fun project to work on. These are some of the initial concept sketches. The idea that it's a Via Verde means the green way. And it's a series of sort of, it's a courtyard, right? There's a series of buildings of different scales that sort of wrap around this courtyard. I don't know if you can, I don't know if this, oh, the pointer, hold on. Oh, let's try that again. So the idea here is there's this courtyard, and you go, these are very, very old plans, so they're slightly different, but the idea is that the scale of building changes from what over here is called, we called them the townhomes, to this area here, which is the lower mid-rise, and then there's over here, the upper mid-rise. So the mid-rise portion were actually these duplex units, which were really sort of an interesting thing. And then there was the tower, and the tower was over here. And interestingly enough, these projects, this was all affordable housing, and I'll show you in the, I think you can't really see it very well, but the idea here is the townhomes and the mid-rise on this side of the stair core were all cooperatives. So they were ownership units, right? So they were affordable, but they were affordable to allow people to buy them, right? And then this 150 low-income rental units, these were all rentals. And it was funny because during construction, the developers were Phipps and Jonathan Rose companies, and they initially had wanted the townhomes as ownership because they thought they would sell better. They had more of like a homey feel, so they thought that those would be sort of more marketable for ownership units. But during construction, when we actually started to get to the height of the sort of the 20th floor at the tower, there were some really amazing views from these units, and all of the living rooms have corner windows. So the renters actually got the best views in this project. And from the staircase, which I guess I don't have the right photo here, but I'm gonna go back here. This, if you look over here, this is the tower, and this is the staircase windows would be over here. They actually look to the city, so you can sort of see like the city skyline from the staircase. And one of the things we were really trying to do in this project was focus on active design. And that is really looking at how you can promote physical fitness and activity through like the design of your building, right? So this is one of the first projects that started to integrate it, and we got, this project got LEED, I think LEED Gold, and we were able to get sort of an innovation credit for active design before it was actually one of the credits that was sort of allocated. And part of what we tried to do was really incorporate light into the staircase, and signage, and really just encourage the use of stairs. So not to this day, but when we were giving tours, we would take everybody through the stairs. Everybody wanted to take the elevator. We always took them through the stairs, the idea of really just promoting it. And it was funny because when we were working on the project, we had this, there's a concept of, there's elevator music. So we had our imaginary playlist of our stair music. There is no music in the stair, but at the time we were thinking about it. And it's funny because there are actually now projects that have music in the staircase. And it was funny because when we were doing this, the developer was like, no, we're not going to do that. But now there are actually projects that have that. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say one more thing on this project. You're being modest. This is really like one of the coolest buildings like in the world. I'm dead serious. So students definitely look it up. Via Verde. It's a global model for affordable housing design. It's something that across in the images this is in a part of the South Bronx that had seen decades of disinvestment, extreme racial and economic segregation and inequality. And this team, really put together and showed that design can be a tool to address some of our cities / society's biggest challenges. And it's incredible. And a very important point is that it is aging well.
Yes.
Right?
And actually,
point.
So it's really interesting. It got a ton of awards. It got a ton of recognition to the point where the residents don't want tours. Like the delegations of people coming literally internationally for tours were upsetting the residents, right? So we were literally told, we were like, we are no longer allowed to give tours. Nobody's allowed to give tours. So it's actually now, if you get a tour of the building, it's like very rare. But when it opened, it got a lot of tours. It also got a lot of recognition. And one of them was a Brenner grant. And it was really interesting because I remember being at the conversation of the panel for the Brenner grant. And there was a question about the community's opinion about the building. And there was a person who was handling the catering for the event, who was sort of like a community restaurant. And it was interesting because I think it was Susan Sanazzi who just was sort of like just asked like a random person, like, what are your thoughts? And it was really good feedback, I think. But one of the things though, is that project, while it was amazing, it's going to change. It's changing the demographics of the neighborhood. And I think there's a question about, is it inevitable? What did we start? There's a huge development now happening just south of it called La Centrale, which is massive. And so it's good in that it's sort of the back end of a commercial strip. So it was a very dark street. So I do think that does need to be activated, but the question of, who gets to live there and who, this project, or at least Via Verde, was 100% affordable housing, right? The definition though, the definition of affordable housing in New York is also a little bit higher. And that's another sort of thing that we have to think about, that I became more aware of. I gave a panel about this project with another project in Philadelphia called Paseo Verde, which is the same developer, but but in Philadelphia, similar project. And when we were giving the panel in Philadelphia, I showed the numbers of sort of the cost of the rents on one of the slides, and there was a question. There was like 160 AMI, that's the annual median income. And they were like, how is that affordable? I was like, in New York, a portion of, that is considered affordable, right? So it can range from 20% of the annual median income to 160% and or more. But I think the idea there is that this was a mix of lots of different income types, but all of them being affordable. And it was meant to be a prototype in sustainable affordable housing. It had a lot of things that I do think were modeled like later on. So the idea that agencies can talk to each other and coordinate a little bit better. The idea that, design is possible. Like, a lot of the assumptions were that affordable housing and good design did not go hand in hand, and that sustainability also added a whole extra level of cost, and that was not the case. A lot of the added cost for this project specifically was for remediation of the brownfield site, not necessarily the addition of the materials. It was a different sort of building envelope. So Grimshaw worked on the way that we split up the work was Grimshaw really was in charge of the building envelope, and we were in charge of sort of plan development and sort of like, I like to think of, we were in charge of the horizontal and Grimshaw was in charge of the vertical. And then we coordinated at all of sort of like where those pieces intersected. And so the prefabricated rain screen was really fun to see. It was sort of this module that, mirrors throughout the building that was done through this prefabricated rain screen, and it was built off site, and then it was sort of mocked up and then actually lifted on. And I think one of the things that I found the most sort of interesting career-wise for me was working on this project was when the project architect was out sick or on vacation, and I had to answer all the questions, right? That's sort of, you learn by fire, because they were pouring concrete in the duplex units, and they were like, we have risers coming up. And we're like, oh, we gotta, like, I was literally sitting at the structural engineer.
You're gonna learn today, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because sometimes you get experience in construction early on and sometimes you don't. But I do think that you learn the most when you are actually on site, seeing what you've drawn and how it's getting built and where those issues are and how to resolve them. I think those were probably some of the most interesting, like, learning experiences.
Quick, there's a question. Quick, explain building envelope.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So building envelope, I'm talking about the exterior of the building. So in this case, let me go back a slide or two, see if I get it.
Yeah, the last slide is probably.
Yeah. Go to one. Okay, so here, what we're saying is, well, this isn't a good slide either, but there's the building envelope is really talking about the exterior wall and how it's built, right? So it would be, in this case, we had studs on the inside. And then we had on the outside, we had insulation, and then we had this a series of 3 different components. So the fiber cement panels are these guys right here, the C fiber, the Aurea C. These were Ethernet. Then we had these. This is Prodema, sort of a composite wood panel over here, and then we had the metal panels, which were here. These were the aluminum composite panels here. So the entire assembly, right, would be the exterior facade, like the face that you see here, plus the interior construction of that, right? So that whole, when you draw a wall section, what you're showing there is the building envelope, right? So when you start to take a construction class, those are the details that you'll start to do. So we actually had on this project also a facade consultant specifically to help with the details of this project. I think we used Front for that. And so here, what they did here is, because we had to be so careful on how, how these panels are being brought to the site, this was a mock-up of a few of the different conditions so that we could see how it looked and make sure that all of the pieces fit together prior to them bringing it to the site over here. which you can start to see how they lifted it onto the building. These are.
I just wanted to mention. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
There's a few. We have a few construction science students as well, and just wanted to mention that as part of the construction management work, those full-scale markups are very important to give the client and also the architects and designers an idea of what the final product will look like before they actually put before they order and everything and then install it. So just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Yeah, and this is actually the building envelope for this was pretty fascinating. It was the first and only time I worked on something that was so sort of intricate. A lot of affordable housing, typically, specifically with how sort of the contractors build in New York, is going to be block and plank with brick facade, right? And then the brick gets value engineered out, and you're stuck with EFIS or something else. So this was a really fun sort of project to work on. And the other part that was really exciting, these are final photos. These are not renderings, and they look better than the renderings. And that was something that we were really, it was just really excited about. Another project I worked on while I was at Datner was really interesting. It was for the West Side Federation for Senior Supportive Housing. And it was, I worked on sort of like the pre-design, working with the client on this. It was a senior supportive housing project that was taking away about 300 parking spaces on the Upper West Side on West 108th Street between Columbus and Amsterdam in New York City. So interestingly enough, I show this project because this was one of the it wasn't the first project, but this was a project where we had to go through quite a few community board meetings to get approval to be able to do the project. And it had to go through ULURP, which is the Uniform Land Use Review process, and it requires community input. And a lot of the community, not a lot of the community, but there was a group in the community who really wanted their parking spaces. And so this actually became quite a contentious project. And it was an eye-opening experience to go to the community board meetings and really sort of defend, senior affordable housing. And it's hard, it's hard. This claim for space, I think, is something that is constantly going to be a struggle. I've also worked on projects that have taken away community gardens and sort of given them back. But the idea is that, at least in New York City, there's very little space to build on. So what happens is you're probably taking something away. So I think one of the things that I'm really interested in as an architect, but also as sort of like on the advocacy side, is how do we mediate that? How do we sort of help give the community things that they really need? And a lot of times that's not, the architect doesn't have it's not in the architect's program to do that, right? So you really have to have a client and or an institution that's willing to support sort of the larger vision for what the community needs, right? And so it's sort of like that sort of where you work together. I think that's really important, because one of the things that the community was asking us here was they wanted us to put 4 stories of parking below this building. And that's not something the client was a support, they dealt with senior supportive housing. They're not a parking operator, right? It's also, New York City is rock, right? So like, it's very, very expensive to go 4 stories down. One of the other arguments was, that there's a schoolyard right across the street. So it was like, well, put it below the schoolyard. It's like, well, then you're putting the schoolyard out of commission for how many years to build this underground parking lot. So I think being able to understand that there are different things that are important to different members of the community, and then how to navigate that is complicated, but is also very, very important, right? Because you have to be able to sort of justify and explain why you're doing the things you are doing. Also understanding that there are sort of needs of the community, and how those get heard is is something that I think I'm still learning, but it's very important to do, right? Because I think that, you know, we have to be aware of what the community is looking for, and how the needs are getting translated. So this client actually is very much a community-based organization, and a lot of their projects are in the Upper West Side. So they really didn't necessarily have to do all of the community sessions that they did, but they did because they wanted to make sure that everybody was comfortable with the final sort of scale and project. And I think right now it's under construction. So it's been exciting to sort of see the steel go up and everything else happen after that. So I know we're sort of running close on time, so I'm just going to sort of shift screens. So part of what I started with Gary McNeil, and sort of like my first boss and a mentor of mine, is that I've been very interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. And part of it is because I didn't see anybody who really looked like me when I was in school. I mean, I did see them actually in school, but I had less in the faculty side, and in the profession, I had even less, right? So I think as I get older, I sort of find less and less. And so it's something that I've always been really interested in. One of the things that I mentioned Max earlier, so I'm going to bring it up again because I wear a different hat where I'm president of the Architecture Alumni Group for City College of New York. I'm very proud that I went to that school. It's a public school. And one of the things that recently happened a few years ago was they actually co-named a street after J. Max Bond Jr. And it's on 162nd and St. Nicholas Place in Washington Heights, which is on the block that he lived. And I was able to go to the naming ceremony. And it's so amazing to actually see a street named after an architect, and not just an architect, but like a Black architect. Yeah, that's really something that for me was really sort of a fun experience. And the speeches and recognition of sort of what Max did for the profession were really inspiring. So I just wanted to show like a little picture of that, because if you haven't learned about Max Bond, I encourage you to learn more. I've been involved with sort of women in architecture and really looking at how do you champion women in the profession. They call it sort of like this missing 32%. And if you look at Black women architects, it's less than 2%. So the numbers are really, really low for women of color that are architects. So I think part of what I've been interested over the years is how do we grow this, right? So I've as part of what we're doing with the architecture alumni, we started this Rise Chats series where we're doing these like bi-weekly like office hour chats on different types of topics. We started a book club. We looked at The Color of Law, which is really looking at redlining around the city. But we're trying to have conversations and bridge conversations between students and alumni. And part of that is really just being able to support people who are coming into the profession, right? Like this next generation of architects, like how do we support them? In 2017, right after the last election, I was part of a group called Designers Protest, and we sort of initiated this, what was called a Designers Protest cipher. And it was really looking at how you can use design to look at inequities in the built environment. And it was a little like a day-long charrette. And it was really fun. I think we had 4 or 5 different topics. Dr. Sharon Sutton, actually, I think this is one of her first reappearances into the Center for Architecture in New York after she relocated back to New York. But it was a really great conversation. And from that, I stayed involved and engaged. And I was part of a planning team for the Design Justice Summit, which AI National hosted and coordinated with Co-Locate with Brian Lee out of New Orleans. And it was just a really fun gathering of sort of 24 advocates, 5 experts. So Justin was there. It was just really, really an amazing experience. And it's sort of interesting that now, like 3 years later, we're still building on that effort, which is part of what Dark Matter University is also sort of starting to talk about. I also sort of wanted to highlight some of the work I'm doing with Puerto Rico. This is going to be our 3rd year presenting. I have here we've done this presentation. Pascal Sablon, if you don't know her, you should look her up. She just got recognized by Forbes magazine. She's doing some amazing stuff for Say It Loud and really highlighting women of color. And then Ellen Abraham also has an Architect Pins effort right now. She's at SOM. But Pascal is from Haiti, and Ellen is from Dominica. And what happened was, when we were thinking about what we were going to present about, we really wanted to do a presentation at one of the conferences coming up. And this was a few years ago, and we always do presentations about women in architecture. And we were like, we need to present about something else. And so what we did was we created this presentation called Power to the People, Translating Resilience Through Culture. And what we were looking at is how we as architects of the diaspora are working or can work back in our home countries to support sort of resiliency efforts. And so we looked at case studies of the earthquake in Haiti, and then the Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and now earthquakes, but this is before the last earthquakes in Puerto Rico. But it was really interesting to look side by side at Haiti, Dominica, and Puerto Rico, and sort of like the lessons learned, right? And how culture is such an important part of how these communities were able to really rebuild, right? Because the government was not able or could not help. And so that the importance of sort of community resilience in that. So we've done some panels. We're going to be presenting at the NOMA conference coming up. And it's been really great to sort of build this conversation with my friends and colleagues. I think I have one more. Oh wait, yeah, I have two more. Okay, right. So so this is sort of building on sort of, for me personally, this is really important, the idea of resilience and culture and how it integrates into our practice. It's something that I never really thought about, honestly, until Black Space, which was only a few years ago. And, you know, I sort of read the Black Space Manifesto and been following a lot of the work that they've been doing. And between the Black Space Manifesto and I guess Jack Travis really talking about the aesthetic, right? The African aesthetic in his case with design. I never really thought about what it would mean to bring some of like the Latino culture or the sort of Puerto Rican or Caribbean, like what that aesthetic is. I was never taught it in school. And so it's something right now that I'm really, really interested in exploring. And I find it fascinating that a lot of the recovery efforts in Puerto Rico are actually led by women. They're led by, a lot of the communities are led by women, and it's very matriarchal. And I think that there's some lessons to be learned from like more indigenous, sort of like indigenous cultures, and sort of how they did things before, how they designed, really looking at nature, really looking at resilience. And that's something that I look forward to sort of pursuing in these next stages of my personal career. Yeah, and this picture on the bottom here, these are some students from CUNY Service Corps that went down to help rebuild. And this goes back to sort of the craft, right? Being able to be part of rebuilding and be part of like this construction, I think is something that you learn so much from. So the idea of design build is something that I hope to do, right? I think that there's something really important about that. Yeah, and then this was a pothole in the street that they really just added their own things into it. But I found it so interesting because this was right after one of the first hurricanes, and it's just you know, a testament to that, like the communities will find ways to just put them, you know, embed themselves into the built environment in however that is. And yeah, and this is my grandfather, right? So you know, we say we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. I am all about getting licensed and becoming architects and all of that. But my grandfather was not licensed. He had a third grade education and he built all of this stuff. So I think that acknowledging that a lot of our ancestors were architects, right? Not in the traditional sense, but they did that. They built things. They were visionaries. They had dreams for their families. And I think that that's something for me that is really important. And I always sort of remind myself. Yeah. So that is it for me. I guess I'm going to stop sharing and open it up if anybody has questions. I know I went a little over. I always do that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah. Questions from anyone? So please, if you don't mind, if you could speak up and maybe turn your camera on so you can see who's asking.
I had a question about you said that you did you said that you did a lot of well, the project that you worked on was in affordable housing, and I'm interested in working on projects that involve affordable housing. So like, do you experience a lot of pushback when advocating for like affordable housing in lower income communities? And I'm not looking to like work in like cities. I'm looking to work in more like more rural areas.
Rural areas. So I think that's really interesting, right? So most of my experience has been in big cities, but I do know that there's a huge focus on the gap of sort of affordable housing in sort of suburban and rural areas. And there are people who do have that as a focus. And I will actually look that up for you. I think it's really important. I think there's also a need for architects in those areas because a lot of architects tend to go to the big cities, right? And so what happens is in the rural communities, there's actually a gap of qualified talent to design in these spaces, right? And I went to Greenwood, Mississippi, I think last year for the Association for Community Design. They had a conference there and it was my first time in sort of a small rural town. And it was, it looked partially slightly abandoned, right? Like the spaces, I think that there's a need for community-based design in those areas and figuring out, so each town or municipality might have different types of housing that is affordable, right? And so I think that there's probably a few different places that you can look at. You can look at the town, working for the town, working for city planning, or working for whatever so in New York City, we have the HPD, which is the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. So finding what that version of that is in that town could be one way. The other is to look at developers that are working in that space, right? So I did projects that was Jonathan Rose Companies, right? So Jonathan Rose Companies does projects all across the country, and they are focused on sustainable, affordable housing. They're not the only ones. There's lots of developers that are really focused on sustainable, affordable housing. And so you can look that up really quickly and then find who's working in whichever places. If you have specific places that you're interested in working on, then I would, let's see, how would you find that out? You can look at, maybe look at the AI, I would say the AIA chapters in those areas or the NOMA chapters in those areas to see what architecture firms are there. And see what projects are there. But I think with a little bit of research, I think you can find it, but I will also check to see if there's any sort of recommendations on that. But I think like you may also want to consider the Rose Fellowship, which is a fellowship that goes I think after you graduate, that is with, they pay for your salary for like 2 or 3 years, and you're partnered with a community design or community-based nonprofit. And not all of them are on affordable housing, but each year there's like a different organization, right, and a different topic. And so the one in Greenwood, Mississippi was actually a result of the Rose Fellowship. So that could be an interesting thing for you to look at.
And I put a couple of those links in the chat, including Rose. And just an important point that comes up that I think is good for everybody. So Vanessa was just mentioning, you know, you can work for an architect, okay, you're an architecture school or construction, you can go work for an architect or construction company, but you can also work in other places with your architecture and design backgrounds, right? So you can work for a builder, but you'll hear people say builder or developer. So that's the companies that are, it's literally their business to build or develop the housing or real estate, right? So there are architects that work for developers, right?
Yeah.
And so enterprise, and there are different kinds of developers, including there are companies that all they do is build affordable housing. That's the only thing that they do, right? And so you could also look at those companies and see if there are, you know, job opportunities, but also just to become familiar with that world. Because if you want to be an architect for that type of client, it's important to become familiar with those clients.
Yeah, and another thing I would actually recommend, which is sort of on the networking side, which I didn't fully talk about, but networking is really important, and understanding your network, and it can help you figure out, one, sort of the types of people you want to be around, but also, you know, where you want to go. And so one organization I did not mention is the Urban Land Institute. But the Urban Land Institute is a very expensive organization to be a part of, but as a student, it's actually quite affordable. So I would encourage you to think about the Urban Land Institute. And I'm not sure sort of how it is in your area, but at least if you get on their mailing list, their email list, they have different types of initiatives, and they definitely need to diversify themselves. So you should get all your students as part of the Urban Land Institute. Seriously. It'd be a good Tuskegee initiative.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions, quickly?
I got a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I think you're.
Cool.
Say it again. Repeat it. Sorry, you broke up a little bit.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. You mentioned that even after you got your architecture license, you still went back to school, and I was wondering, encourage you to do that.
Okay, so I think that what I realized for myself was that I wasn't actually interested in architecture, as in the brick and mortar of architecture. I was interested in working more with people. And a lot of what I love doing is working with students, is working with young professionals, is looking at issues of equity, diversity, inclusion. And I hadn't actually been I had been working in architecture and then doing all this other stuff on the side, right? So when I decided to pivot my career and I was thinking about what I wanted to, where my skill set was, I realized that I was a lot more interested in sort of planning and policy, right? So when I started to look at jobs related to planning and policy, I was underqualified. And I say that because I had 10 years of practicing as a registered architect. I have my own architecture firm, but I don't have experience working specifically in community organizing, which is something that I'm very interested in doing, right? And a lot of those jobs are like $40,000 coming out of school, right? And that is like, it was like half, like more than half of a pay cut. So the other part is I am very interested in having a small practice, but also teaching. And I felt that graduate school would help me in that. Another thing, and this is personal for me, right? So I wear a lot of hats. I do a lot of things. I'm a little bit all over the place. What graduate school is allowing me to do is to start to focus what I'm doing. And I say that in that I do architecture, I'm interested in advocacy. And so what I'm now starting to do is figure out, how do I piece that together? I don't think I need it. It's just something that will help me. I think it will help me in the long term for what I want to do with Puerto Rico. Because what I'm learning is the politics and the policies that are impacting the recovery efforts of Puerto Rico are way beyond what an architect is able to do or understand. And so for me, it's allowing me to sort of align my interests to better learn how to speak that language. And I will say it's a very different language. I don't consider myself necessarily an academic. And I'm, researching scholars now and doing sort of scholarly papers, and it's very different than I expected. But I'm taking a class on gentrification. I'm taking a class on urban data analysis and citizen participation. So those are all things that I'm really, really interested in doing. So I'm excited to do it. I don't think it's needed, especially I think now. If I was younger, I think I could do it like real quick. I feel like there's an entrepreneurial spirit in a lot of the grads that are coming out, that they're just, I feel like you just have the opportunity to do it. I think I could too, but because I'm older, I think people, this is gonna sound weird, but like I think when they see my resume, they think that I'm like over here, and I'm like, it doesn't align, like the positions are not aligning right now. So that's one of the big reasons why I'm going back. Also, the school I'm going to is Hunter College, and this sort of brings it a little bit back. So Hunter is a city university in New York, so it's public education, but Hunter has the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. And so I am trying to tie it back to be able to do a little bit more research about things that I really want to learn about that I was not able to focus on. And that's another reason why I'm going back. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
There's just a quick follow-on that I have on that. So earlier in the presentation, Vanessa mentioned something about kind of professionally ending up not just hitting a ceiling, but kind of ending up in a corner. And this happens a lot to people, and especially to people of color, right? Because it's like you'll get certain opportunities, and then it's like, okay, you're good at this thing, and you become sort of that thing alone, and it becomes harder to transition. And you have to start being really strategic, right? Yeah. So if it's like, okay, there are these other things that I'm good at and I care about, you want to do that work to kind of position yourself to kind of get out of the corner. To be very honest with you.
Yeah, and for me, so I of my classmates, I am probably the only person who stayed in one place for so long. I love that I did it, because the skills that I learned there and the projects that I've worked on have, they really give me a solid professional background to do what I want to do next, right? I don't think that if I would have sort of made different sort of like shifted careers every 2 years, which a lot of my peers did, that I would have the same sort of solid foundation of working in a firm, right? So there's two separate things, right? You can, I do think it takes at least 2 or 3 years to really learn things in a firm. So as you're making those decisions, try and feel that out. But the reality is also that things are changing really fast, right? And so some firms are slower to change. And you also want to be able to think about you're working in a firm that aligns with your values is really important. And for me, what was happening is that people were coming into the firm who had other experience, right? So they were bringing their experience from other firms into the firm. So they were able to contribute more, right? And so I felt that for me, because I had been in the same place, I had only seen that one type of thing. And I knew sort of like, call it like the way of that we were practicing, and that's the way we did it, right? Whereas I didn't have a larger sort of umbrella of knowledge from other firms or other types of work that I could bring, because I came in sort of right at, only a few years out of school, right? So for me, part of it also was that I was really good at finishing projects. I was really good at certain things, and I was interested in getting involved in the front end of a project, but I was sort of like too old to be on the front end because I was too useful at the other end. so it was like, you get really good at one thing. It's hard because you have to balance it with the type of workload and having the right team. And I was very good at facilitating teams, right? So I was in sort of a project manager role, and I mean, I love project management, but I think one of the things that it's, if you ever do these like personality quizzes or I forgot which one it is, but they say that people tend to work in their zone of excellence. But what you really want to do is try and work in your zone of genius. And the idea there is that you can do something that you're really good at and you'll be fine, right? But it's still sort of work, right? And so what you really want to do is you want to find where what you're doing is completely natural and it's your best self, right? And whatever that is. And for me, it's not necessarily design in the traditional sense. It's not necessarily sort of like understanding the nuts and bolts. I like sort of working with people. And when you're project managing, you're a lot more dealing with the details. And there's people who absolutely love that.
Right.
And so that's why I'm all about putting the right sets of people together, because I know like the skill sets and I can do that. But for me to do it, it just takes a lot longer, and I could do it well. But that's not my zone of like genius, I'm still trying to find it.
Great, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can we get Morgan? Are you on?
Yeah. I have a question. Like kind of a universal question. Do you think architects are conscientious? Like you mentioned, when you add, you're possibly taking something away.
Yeah, so I think architects are. I think it's inherent in what we do. I think we are constantly conscious of the decisions that we're making. I think one of the things that I've noticed is that architects are only one piece of a larger puzzle, right? And so that's part of why I'm also sort of interested in going back, is understanding that there's all these other pieces that go into making a building happen, or that go into making like cities happen. And understanding all of those structures that are in place is very, very important. So a lot of times when an architect is brought on board, they have like 1/20th of the pie of what is happening. And they've already sort of been given the parameters that are probably not the right ones, right? So one of the things that I'm really a proponent of is having architects at the table earlier on, before a lot of these decisions are made, to help with sort of that visioning process of like understanding like what is the right solution. But a lot of times when architects are brought on board, the budget has already been decided, the location has already been decided, the whole team has already been decided, the program has already been decided. And so as an architect, you're sort of like, so what do you want me to do? Just like put all these pieces together that don't work and find the best possible solution? And that's sort of what's happening, So I think the idea to be able to think through these things, I think that's the ideal scenario. And I think that's where architects are actually most valuable. So we just have to work on getting those types of that type of work, and having developers understand, or clients or cities or whatever it is, understand that design thinking is really important, and that you can't just look at one side of the picture. And that's a lot of times what happens. It's just one group. A lot of the rezonings that are happening currently in New York, there's a lot of sort of issues or things that need to get thought about, and they look at just housing, and they don't look at the implications on like the transportation system or the people that are going to be displaced or all of these other things. And so I think that there's an awareness of it, but right now there's maybe a few good examples, but I think that there's still work to do on that. But I do think architects are conscious about it, but a lot of times it's out of their control. And so part of what we're trying to do through some of this other collective work is, how do we hold ourselves accountable, right? As architects, you're required to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public, right? And that's one of the reasons why you're going to school and why you take these exams. It's all about that. And so what we're trying to do is like define that, like, right? If what we're doing is harmful to people, then that's a problem, right? And we have to be accountable to that. But we also, architecture is a business, right? So we have to figure out, how do we balance it? Because it can be very, when you talk about ethics, some of these issues are extremely ethical, right? Like, people make conscious decisions to work on certain types of projects. And those projects can be harmful, right? And so, I mean, I personally, I've made it a choice, but I'm privileged in that I can do that, right? Not everybody has the ability to choose the type of work they work on, right? So I think that's the other part that as a profession, we have to figure out, right? How do we work on projects that are not harmful, right? And the definition of that is different for different people. And that is, I guess, the constant sort of struggle of trying to get everybody to understand that we are supposed to be sort of citizen architects and stewards of healthy environments, and we haven't been the best at that. I think we could definitely be better, but I do think that it is inherent to sort of what an architect is, to think about that.
Anyone else? We're a little over, so I know we're okay.
Oh, I see one from Zaria. First step right after graduating from college. So I tried to get a job, or I had the job from college that I transferred out. So like I had a job. So I think the first thing you want to do is look at getting a job. And I do think that professional organizations such as NOMA or AIA or USGBC, whichever group you're interested in, are helpful in that first job. And also alumni and professors of your schools, right? Those are always like great resources. So I encourage you to check those out.
Right. Yeah, but Vanessa mentioned a term earlier, your network, right? So even as a student, you can start to, build your Rolodex or your network of, I guess they don't have Rolodex anymore, your list of people and contacts, and start building that out early. And you have what people call informational interviews, right? So you can just talk to people. They may not have a job opportunity there, and you may not sort of go into it saying, I'm going to get a job out of this, but you do an informational interview just so that people know that you're looking, and you can start to build your network, because they may know someone that has an opportunity, or they may see an opportunity come up and they'll think, oh yeah, and they'll send it to you, right? So start doing that work, spend a little time building your network. Vanessa just mentioned LinkedIn. Start your LinkedIn profile. Even though you won't have a ton of experience, you can still start kind of having a
you can start it, and you can friend us, right? And then you can start looking at all of our connections and figure out, who do you want to get connected to? I'm serious, like you can do that. Like that is what people are doing right now. It's surprising. For the longest time I was not, and I'm still not as active as I could be, but it is a resource professionally. that you can use.
Yep.
So I would encourage you to look at that.
Start by starting.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and I think also, Roderick, I'll be sure to send this to you if you don't have it, but I think NOMA has a foundation fellowship that they're starting that is geared towards the students. And I think it's geared towards the HBCUs. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that group. But you can send it as well. We'll share it again. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much. Let me just do one thing as we end today. If you could unmute yourselves or turn your mic on, and let's give Miss Vanessa, I'm gonna say Alicea-Chuqui. Did I get close?
Venesa Alicea-Chuqui. It's okay.
Yeah, so let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you.
Woohoo!
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Been great. Reminder, your reflection form papers forms are due Wednesday. So if you could, guys can get those done. And remember, just complete sentences on those. And maybe you can, I'm gonna make copy of the chat. I normally do that. But if you can, you can also do that for yourselves for notes. And we'll see you, I think next week we'll be participating in a webinar.
Yeah, I can speak briefly about that. So yeah, so next week there's a webinar, lecture happening at Columbia University that has some of our Dark Matter University members participating that will just be really interesting. So there's a group of Black architects that were selected by the Museum of Modern Art here in New York City to highlight their work as Black architects. And so they're going to be sharing some of the work that they've been doing and talking about, which is called Reconstructions. So it's a reference to the period of Reconstruction in US history following the end of the Civil War, where there was a lot of progress for Black communities being able to sort of build and have power, and they're translating that into their work as Black architects and designers. So we thought it would be just interesting for you to see some of their work. These are architects from across the US that have different types of practices. So we'll have you join us for that.
That's great. That's gonna be fun.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, and we'll look forward to.
Great. Have a wonderful day.
All right.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.